about trophic dynamics and its influence on ecosystem processes. So first let's start to discuss how energy actually flows through an ecosystem. So the energy comes from the sun and plants capture that energy through the process of photosynthesis. And they store that energy in their plant tissues as biomass. And then those plant tissues, and then energy is then stored and transferred among trophic levels. So when an herbivore eats the plant tissues, energy is transferred from the plant to the herbivore. And then when a carnivore eats the herbivore, energy is transferred to that carnivore. And just to remind you, the photosynthesis is the conversion of so in the with the use of carbon dioxide and water, and in the presence of light, sugars are formed and oxygen is released as a byproduct. And as we've talked about before, net primary productivity is all the plant biomass or all the carbon or energy stored within the plant. And just to remind you that gross primary productivity is all the carbon gained through photosynthesis. And then we know that carbon is lost through respiration. So the NPP is the carbon that's stored in the biomass. And in ecosystems, carbon is an energy source. So we can think about energy transfer similarly as we think about carbon transfer. So here's just a schematic or a graph of looking at different trophic levels that you may have discussed in other courses or in other education experience. On the bottom here, we have the primary producers. So those are those autotrophs that can make their own food and convert carbon dioxide to carbohydrates. We then have our primary consumers that eat those primary producers. And then we can have our uh, carnivores or that eat those primary consumers. And then we can have our predators, the secondary or tertiary consumers that eat those primary consumers. However, it is a little complex that we do have some organisms that are omnivores, so we both eat primary consumers but also eat primary producers. So it's a little more complex than just a basic trophic cascade. So when we're talking about energy transfer, we need to understand two laws of thermodynamics. The first law is that energy can be transferred or transformed, but it can never be created or destroyed. So the amount of energy that we have in a given ecosystem does not change. The second law of thermodynamics is that the quality of matter or energy deteriorates gradually over time or as it is transformed or transferred. And so the usable energy can be converted to unusable energy. So we don't lose energy from the system, but the quality and the ability for other organisms to use it can change. So here's just a basic, what we might call, or looking at energy transfer. The top is looking at, what we're looking at right now is the terrestrial ecosystem. So on the left, those boxes are proportioned to the amount of energy at that trophic level. So the most energy is found in our primary producers. And as we move up a trophic level, we have less and less energy available, or the quality of energy available for our primary and secondary carnivores. So on the left is energy, on the right is biomass. So we see in a terrestrial ecosystem, the energy and biomass is similar. So where we have um, lots of energy, we also have lots of biomass. And I just wanted to show you in contrast to aquatic systems. So aquatic systems, the energy amount among the different trophic levels is about the same as terrestrial ecosystems. However, the biomass is very different, where we have a lot less biomass in the primary producers in an aquatic system than we have in the primary carnivores. If we think about the biomass that's eaten by herbivores in an aquatic system, it's usually very small organisms like phytoplankton. So it doesn't have a lot of biomass. It also doesn't have a lot of structure. So plants growing in aquatic systems don't need all of that cellulose and lignin to hold the plant up against gravity because they're in water. So there's not as much structural component needed in those primary producers. However, in contrast, the carnivores, because they are swimming around or in the water, they can produce more biomass because they don't have to have as much, uh, or they're not limited as much with that gravity component. So when we're thinking about energy flow in ecosystems, we can consider the term ecological efficiency. So that's the percent of energy that's transferred from one trophic level to the next trophic level. So thinking about how much energy is transferred, say, from the primary producers to the primary consumers, and then how much energy is transferred from the primary consumers to those carnivores. And in a very general sense, about 10% of energy passes between trophic levels. Now, this is very general. We know that if you look across different ecosystems and different organisms, that this actually varies quite a bit. So ecological efficiency has three main components. One is the consumption efficiency, the second is assimilation efficiency, and the third is production efficiency. So here's what that can look like. We've got our primary producers. So the transfer of energy from the primary producer to the consumer is called our trophic efficiency. Now, the consumption, assimilation, and production efficiency are all looking at within a trophic level. So how does the efficiency of transfer occur within the trophic level? While trophic efficiency is between trophic levels. So here's what this looks like. We can think of the top here, net primary productivity. That's all of the energy produced for the ecosystem. Now we know if we look at plants, there's a large component of plants that can't be eaten by primary consumers. We can think about trees. A lot of the woody component is not eaten by primary consumers. And even grasses, a large part of grasses are not consumed by herbivores. So only of what is produced from primary producers, only a portion of that is actually eaten and consumed because a lot of that is not able to be consumed. And then it eventually dies and goes into this pool of what we call detritus. So the consumption efficiency is that portion of primary productivity that's available, but only the portion that's actually consumed. So consumption efficiency is the amount of production consumed by the next trophic level. For primary consumers, much of primary productivity is unedible, like wood, these very structural components that have lignin and cellulose that are harder to digest. So we can actually calculate the consumption efficiency by looking at the consumed energy divided by the net production energy of the previous trophic level. So how much energy did we have in net primary productivity, and then the proportion that is consumed. So here's just kind of looking at in a forested system, a large part of that might not be consumed because a lot of it is woody components. However, in a grassland system, we might see a larger portion of the primary productivity being consumed. So our consumption efficiency might be greater in, say, a grassland system than in a forested system. So once it's consumed, some of, not all of that is consumed is used for that organism's biomass. So it's some of it is released through feces and urine. So assimilation efficiency is of what's consumed, what is used in biomass. So we can think of assimilation efficiency as the percent of ingested material that's actually assimilated by the organism. It depends on the digestibility of food. So foods that are harder to digest, thinking for humans like celery or other bran, like heavy bran type components, a portion of that our body just doesn't digest, and so we just excrete it. Um, so much of plant biomass is difficult to digest. Sorry. So things like cellulose and lignin, these are structural components that are harder to break down. Also things like secondary metabolites. With plants, anything that's not photosynthesis is considered a secondary compound. So plants can produce tannins and alkaloids. So for some organisms, these can actually be toxic. And here's just a great example of a simulation efficiency. So it's what is ingested, the energy that's ingested, minus what's egested, so either regurgitated or excreted out. And owls are a really good example of this. Here's an example where an owl would consume an entire mouse, but we know that they actually either poop out or actually vomit out the bones and hair that's not digestible. So assimilation efficiency can be calculated by the assimilated energy divided by the ingested energy. And food sources vary quite a bit in their assimilation efficiency. So, for example, seeds can have a really high assimilation efficiency. When an organism eats a seed, a large portion of that is actually assimilated. Um, and young vegetation like new leaves or new shoots also have a high assimilation efficiency. Now the assimilation efficiency starts to decrease with things like leaves and twigs and wood. Insects have a high assimilation efficiency, so of what an organism eats in the insects, a high proportion of that is used or assimilated. And then also animals have a high assimilation efficiency if you're eating animals. So this kind of brings us to a question that we might ask is like, why don't hummingbirds eat wood? So hummingbirds are constantly moving their wings. They use a lot of energy, so they need a high amount of energy to maintain their function. Okay, so once that energy is assimilated, some of it can be lost through respiration, and then what goes into producing biomass, secondary production, um, is the next step that we're going to look at. So this is the production efficiency. So the percent of assimilated energy that goes to producing new biomass, so new growth, new in reproduction. Other assimilated energy gets lost through respiration or it's used up. So in the process of respiration, energy is used for thermoregulation, movement, blood circulation, essentially like maintenance of the organism. So production can equals the assimilated energy minus what's lost through respiration. Now, if we look at primary producers versus herbivores and carnivores, about 50 to 70% of assimilated energy is actually used just for maintenance, not necessarily going into new production. However, in contrast, herbivores and carnivores, their assimilation energy is a little higher in terms of what they need to use for maintenance. So the next thing we want to talk about is net production efficiency. So this is taking into account the energy used for growth and the energy used in offspring divided by the assimilated energy. So of the energy they assimilated, what proportion goes into growth and growing new offspring? So birds, about less than 1% of energy is net production is used for growth and energy. Um, um, and then, in contrast, we have cold-blooded animals that have really high production efficiency. So net production efficiency is inversely related to the activity level. So homeotherms, those are organisms that can regulate their body temperature. They tend to have a 1 to 6% production efficiency. So it's meaning that a high proportion of the assimilated energy is used for maintenance. It takes a lot of energy to maintain organisms' bodies at a certain temperature and to thermoregulate them. However, poikilotherms um, don't have thermoregulation. They tend to rely on the environment around them to keep their bodies warm or cold. And so they have a higher net production efficiency. So more energy can go into production because they're using less for maintenance. So all in all, ecological efficiency can be calculated by the consumption of energy um, multiplied by the assimilation efficiency multiplied by the net production efficiency. And that equals net production energy. And then this is the amount of energy that is available for the next trophic level. So here's just another way to look at that. Again, all of the energy comes from the sun, and plants use the energy from the sun to create carbohydrate, and they and use it in carbon uptake. They store carbohydrates and carbon and energy in their net primary productivity. However, not all of that net primary productivity can be consumed by the primary producers because it's just not digestible. Of what's consumed, some of that energy is excreted or lost or excreted, and then what is then goes on to um, used for maintenance and production. Organisms lose some energy through respiration, so that's the energy used for maintaining their bodies, and then a small portion of that goes into the actual production, and that's what's available for the energy available for the next trophic level. So here's just a little quiz question to kind of test your knowledge. So all of these factors reduce the efficiency of energy transfer between trophic levels except what? Okay, so the correct answer is C, biomass stored as fat or starch, sorry. The other three, heat loss during maintenance, reduces the efficiency for the next energy transfer between trophic levels, so does indigestibility of biomass, and also lack of availability of some biomass. Okay, so there's some general rules for energy flow through ecosystems. The first is that assimilation efficiency increases at higher trophic levels. So, and then the second is that net production efficiencies decrease at higher trophic levels. And then the ecological efficiencies average about 10%, although the range is much wider than that. That's kind of the general ecology answer, is that there's about 10% transfer of energy, but it's much more variable than that. All right, so here's a little testing your knowledge. So in this scenario, if grain is eaten by cows and cows are eaten by humans, if the ecological transfer efficiency between each trophic level is 10%, how much grain is required to produce 70 kilograms of human biomass? So with each trophic level, 10% of that energy is transferred. And if we've got a 70 kilogram human biomass of 70 kilograms, how much grain do we need? So here's an example, and I'm sorry my head is hiding some of the equations here, but essentially we got to think about adding, we started with 70 kilograms in humans. We know only about 10% of the energy from previous trophic level is transferred, so we can multiply that by 10%, and we get that the amount of energy in primary producers and the cows they ate was about 700 kilograms. Then we can multiply it by that by 10%, and that gives us about 7,000 kilograms of primary primary production in the primary producers needed to support 70 kilograms of human biomass. Now let's say humans eat the grains directly instead of eating the cows, so they're eating more of a plant-based diet. How much grain is required to produce 70 kilograms of human biomass if we're assuming that 10% ecological transfer efficiency? So in this, we're eating the grains directly, so only about 700 kilograms are needed to produce 70 kilograms of human biomass. And so this is some people's justification for being vegetarian or eating mostly plant-based diets is that less energy is needed. We don't need to grow as much food because we don't need as much energy if we're eating those grains directly versus if we're eating the primary producers who are then eating the grains. Okay, so just to um, as so only about 1% of net primary productivity actually ends up as production of the third trophic level. So that's pretty small. So we need a lot of net primary productivity to produce a lot of higher organisms. Okay, so that also emphasizes the importance of net primary productivity. We've got to get those producers producing that carbon and that energy so that we have enough energy for higher trophic levels. So as we've talked a little bit about before is, what understanding what controls net primary productivity is really important for understanding the available energy for other trophic levels. Um, and there's a little video, it's just a short little video about trophic levels that I find kind of fun if you want to watch that on your own time. Okay, so variation in or presence or absence of key traits can affect ecosystem processes. So we've talked in the past that biogeochemical cycles, biophysical processes, and disturbance regime can affect ecosystem processes, but also very important is that the trophic structure can affect ecosystem processes. So here's just an example. I think this pictures are from Australia. On the left is a place that was uh, lightly grazed, and then on the right is a heavily grazed system. And you can see that there's a lot more bare ground and disturbance when we overgraze these systems, which then can affect the productivity of the system. So here's just a looking at that when we look at net primary productivity, only about 10% of that net primary productivity goes to herbivores. So what happens to the other 90%? Well, the other 90% becomes detritus or dead plant litter, which can then get decomposed by microorganisms. So 90% of net primary productivity goes to detritivores, which are organisms that eat detritus or dead leaves or dead organic matter. So what controls the amount of NPP transferred to herbivores versus detritivores? So NPP provides an upper limit to energy flow through the food webs. So only the amount of energy that is produced by the net primary productivity can influence what's available for higher trophic levels. So plant tissue quality is really a major control over transfer to herbivores. So how yummy or how digestible is that plant tissue? And then animals rely often on microsymbiotes to digest lignin and cellulose. So we know that cows have multiple stomachs that can help do this. There's also some other symbiotic relationships with other organisms that can help break down these more harder to digestible tissues. Plants also produce defense compounds that are toxic to herbivores. So plants don't want the a plant doesn't want to be completely eaten because if they're completely eaten, then they can't photosynthesize and produce and reproduce. And so plants in places where potentially could be a high herbivore pressure can create these defense compounds for to minimize herbivory. So remember that microbes feeding styles are much more biochemically diverse than animals. So we can have microbes that are specifically designed to or specifically adapted to digesting lignin and cellulose versus the easier digestible. We also have microbes that can help digest some of these toxic compounds. So here's just an example of, we've got cows that have many herbivores have, like large ungulates, have multiple stomachs that help them digest that very cellulose dense grass that they eat. Also, termites can help break down some of that organisms as well. So a little bit about plant defense compounds. Let me just add all of this. So plant defense compounds can come into two categories. They can be carbon-based defenses. They're using carbon to create these defenses, and they have no nitrogen, or they're nitrogen-based defenses. And so, of course, they contain nitrogen. So carbon-based defenses reduce the palatability and digestibility of the plant material, and they often can be present in high concentrations. And these examples are tannins, lignins, resins, and essential oils. Um, they can lead to decreased productivity. So an ecosystem that has a lot of plants that have high carbon-based defenses often can have a lower productivity on whole. And then carbon-based defenses that are tend to be lower tend to have a higher productivity. And one thing to think about is for a plant to make these carbon defenses, it costs them carbon or energy, so it can be energy intensive. Okay, so the other type of plant defense compounds are nitrogen defense compounds. These can be toxic and actually damage herbivore cells. They're often presented in low concentrations. We've talked about that nitrogen is hard to come by for plants, and so they can't necessarily afford to put a whole bunch of nitrogen in these defense compounds. So they often are just enough to make them toxic, but not too much that they'll be limited by nitrogen for their growth. These often include alkaloids and anthocyanins, and we generally would see nitrogen-based compounds, plants that have nitrogen-based defense compounds in ecosystems that tend to have a higher nitrogen availability. Low nitrogen availability systems often don't have as much of these nitrogen-based defense compounds. So structural materials are similar to carbon defense. So in addition to these carbon and nitrogen defense compounds, the plants can have structural compounds that can inhibit herbivory. They can reduce palatability, digestibility, and they're often present in high concentrations, and this could be things like lignin and cellulose. The allocation to structure varies among ecosystems. Grasslands that don't have very much wood end up transferring more of their NPP to herbivores. In contrast, a forest system that has a lot of that woody component, those carbon and structural compounds, defense compounds, tend to reduce the amount of net primary productivity that's transferred to herbivores. And in aquatic systems, plants allocate very little to structure, and about 50% of net primary productivity can be transferred to herbivores. And then here's this, I showed you this earlier, where we see that because like in aquatic systems, the plants don't need as much structural components, they don't need as much herbivore defenses, so they often don't have as much biomass, but they still have a lot of energy in the primary producers. And here's just an example looking at the relationship between tannin, which is a nitrogen defense compound, and the number of leaves produced. So for a given plant that has a high tannin concentration, they tend to produce less leaves. So again, this costs them nitrogen to produce these tannins, and so that can come at an expense of about producing more leaves. All right, so here's just kind of looking at trophic levels, groupings of species. So when we think about trophic levels, each of these levels are just grouping of species with similar feeding relationships, so what type of food they eat. It's useful in sort of our basic understanding about energy transfer in ecosystems. However, it is a bit oversimplified. So we have talked about that we can have omnivores that can eat both primary producers and primary consumers. We also have these detritivores that can make this food trophic levels more complex. And we often think of them now as food webs, where there's multiple interactions and multiple levels than we would normally think of with just a basic trophic cascade. And this one just kind of shows an example of a plant-based food chain is the solid lines, while the Hatch lines are a detritus-based food chain. So what controls the abundance and productivity of organisms at any given trophic level? So often in ecology and trophic dynamics, we think about bottom-up versus top-down controls. So in a bottom-up control, the biomass at any trophic level is controlled by the resource availability of plant productivity. So the bottom-up is like what controls plant productivity controls all of the everything at higher trophic levels. A top-down control, which might be one you're more familiar with, is where biomass at a trophic level is controlled by the consumers. So often we think of things like when we have wolves in a system, the wolves could potentially drive availability at lower trophic. And here's just looking at the difference between a plant-based trophic system and a detritus-based trophic system. So in a detritus-based trophic system, the net NPP is what the primary producer is producing is that soil organic matter, that dead organic matter coming from the net primary productivity. So that is the energy source for bacteria and fungi and other trophic levels or higher trophic levels. So we think about trophic cascades, a strong top-down force, which is often called a brown world, controls plants. So this is an example like, say, if we remove wolves from the system, there's not as much predator on elk and other ungulates, and then they can overbrowse the plants like willow, and it can lead to a more browning of the ecosystem. So when are they most likely? Where ecosystems have much more simple food chains, more linear. We don't have as many complexity in the system, and systems that are generally lower diversity systems, and places where there are highly edible plant biomass, and places where we don't see a lot of environmental change. The brown world hypothesis is not as common than what we call the bottom up or the primarily green world hypothesis. And why is that? Is because the food webs are much more complex. They're not linear. Long-lived plants can be well defended with lots of structure that can control then the energy going to higher trophic levels. Most environments are heterogeneous. I can never say that, but they're more complex and more diverse systems, and they tend to have relatively higher diversity